Excellent. Excellent. Thanks for that very warm introduction. So yeah, today I'll be telling you a little bit about what my PhD work has been on. I've been working on this for 5 years almost now, from 2017. I've had a lot of collaborators, and it's been a really large collaborative effort. But right now I just want to jump right into it. So, as I'm sure many of you know, global bird populations are in decline. This is really nicely illustrated in this Rosenberg et al. 2019 paper. In North America, you can see this dramatic decline in almost every type of bird, every grouping of bird, other than wetland birds, so your geese and swans. In North America itself, bird populations have declined by around 3 billion birds, or 29% since 1970. So that's a huge amount of loss. You know, the other important thing to note here is that that estimate doesn't even include seabirds. And seabirds have declined by around 70% since 1950. And of that, what makes that even worse is that only 19% of the species are monitored enough to make population trend inferences. So this estimate is actually probably pretty conservative, and the losses of birds might be much, much higher than this. And so the question might be, well, what does it matter? What does it matter if all these seabirds are being lost? Well, seabird declines have significant impacts on ecosystems. They're super important for ecosystem nutrient cycling, soil formation, and terrestrial marine plant communities, diversity, and fertility. So they have not only a really important impact on the marine ecosystem, but also the terrestrial ecosystem. And these huge amounts of loss are likely going to have widespread consequences and downstream consequences on ecosystems. And these losses are pretty common, and they're extremely, they've been shown in the seabird that I'll be focusing on today, called the Leach's storm-petrel. Leach's storm-petrel was recently classified as vulnerable by the IUCN. They are amongst the most abundant seabird in the world, but they are also nocturnal and they nest on remote islands. Now, because they're nocturnal and they nest on remote islands, it means that it takes a huge amount of effort to do censusing or mark and recapture traditional measures of population size. And because it takes so much effort to get at census data, there's actually very little or sparse data. However, global census data have shown that this Leach's storm-petrel population has declined by over 30%. And this 30% decline from 1977 until 2016 is an estimated loss of 2 to 2.5 million birds. Huge amount of loss in the ecosystem. Now, unfortunately, because there's sparse data and the data only began to be collected in 1977 and later, it's difficult to distinguish between anthropogenic drivers of population decline and natural drivers of population decline or natural fluctuation. So there's a variety of anthropogenic drivers that could be causing the storm-petrel population to decline. It could be things like elevated selenium, cadmium, and mercury in the tissue in the eggs, as well as light pollution, which can distract and confuse migratory seabirds. Note that Leach's storm-petrels are also nocturnal, so these kinds of light pollution can really negatively impact them. But it's also important to note that natural dynamics can also affect population trends. So this can include things like prey fluctuations, which can increase and decrease naturally over periods of decades to centuries based on shifting ice dynamics, as well as shifts in currents, and multi-decadal oscillation can change fish abundance and community structure. So the question becomes, and really the crux of my thesis is, how can we identify the driver and the extent of population loss? Is it possible for us to get at long-term data to disentangle natural variation in a population from anthropogenic drivers of population decline? And I would argue, yeah, it is possible using a technique called paleolimnology. So what is paleolimnology? Well, paleolimnology is, in a nutshell, the study of the physical, chemical, and biological material preserved in lake sediments. And so because lake sediments are continually accumulating the changes that are happening within a lake and around the lake, it's possible to go and analyze those changes. But you might be asking, how is it possible that we can track seabirds in terrestrial or freshwater lakes? Well, it looks something like this. So if we start on the left here, seabirds are typically at the top of their food web. They're upper trophic organisms, which means that they biomagnify and bioaccumulate high concentrations of nutrients and metals up the food web. So for, in this example, storm-petrels, the food web looks like phytoplankton, up to zooplankton, up to the fish that the Leach's storm-petrel feeds on. They then collect those nutrients and they transport them from their marine feeding grounds to the terrestrial breeding grounds, where they form huge colonies. You can imagine tens of thousands to almost 1 million seabirds, all storm-petrels, nesting on these small islands. These islands then receive nutrients from the storm-petrels in the forms of guano or feces, eggshells, feathers, and carcasses of the birds. Then all of those nutrients that they had accumulated in the marine feeding grounds are washed into the lakes, completely changing the water chemistry and accumulating in the sediments. So to give a little bit of context about how much nutrients are being introduced, annually, seabirds input around 3,800 gigagrams of nitrogen per year and 630 gigagrams of phosphorus per year. And those numbers are a little bit meaningless until you start to compare them to something else. Global fisheries around the world introduce around 3,700 gigagrams of nitrogen and 320 gigagrams of phosphorus per year. So seabirds introduce more nutrients to the terrestrial ecosystem around the world than global fisheries. So I've shown you that seabirds are completely changing the lake sediment chemistry. And so how do we collect a sediment core? Well, it looks something like this. We take our boat and we go onto these lakes that we know have been influenced by the seabird of interest. So for this case, small islands off of the coast of Newfoundland. We know that isotopes, metals, and pollutants are being introduced by the seabirds, as well as pollen, mineral, insect remains from the terrestrial ecosystem. All of that is being washed in and then collects at the bottom in the sediment. As well as those nutrients are changing the water chemistry, which changes the algae and zooplankton, so changing the biological material within the lake. We then take a big tube and we send it down. I like to imagine this like a milkshake. If you had a milkshake and you had a straw, you stick that straw into the sediment, you put your thumb on the top and you pull it out, and then you have a continuous record of changes in the sediment. The top is always going to be the present and the bottom is always going to be the past. And because that record is continuously 7 days a week, all of the biological and chemical material from around the lake, you can then take slices of it, date each slice using a variety of techniques, things like carbon-14 dating, lead-210 dating. You can then get an understanding of what happened in the past. Now, if we want to reconstruct seabird dynamics, unfortunately, you can't just take a sediment core and look at, say, feathers or look at the bones, because they're simply not abundant enough. Seabirds introduce a lot of feces and other nutrients and other products into the lake, but those don't accumulate within the sediment necessarily. So instead, we use indirect proxies of seabird presence. So that can include things like biometals, so things like mercury, cadmium, and zinc, which we know are related to seabirds because they biomagnify, as well as isotopes like nitrogen-14 to nitrogen-15. You can use biomolecules, and then you can use biological proxies, things like diatoms, chironomids, and pollen, and chlorophyll A. So instead of using a single proxy like bones or feathers because they're not abundant enough, we use several indirect proxies that all point towards the same thing to make inferences about seabird in the past. So with that established, I want to go into my first major example on Baccalieu Island. This is where the world's largest Leach's storm-petrel colony exists. So on this map, you can see St. John's would be up here, I think, and Baccalieu is up here. And what we did is we looked at this island because it has the largest colony of storm-petrels, and we looked at several ponds on it. So in this case, 4 ponds, as well as 1 reference site, which you can see here. Now the census data on Baccalieu at the time looks like this. There have only been 2 surveys, the first in 1984 and the second in 2013. Now, based on these 2 surveys, it looks like the population has declined dramatically from 3.3 million pairs of birds down to 1.95 million pairs of birds. So it could look like this, but without more data, it's impossible to look at this and say, what's the magnitude of loss? When did that population originally start to decline? Has it declined by only 40% based on those 2 data points? Or has it declined by 50, 60, or even more percent? We just don't know what the natural baseline of the population is before it began to decline. Another perspective might be that the population isn't even in decline with only 2 data points, and it's impossible to tell. It's possible that the population is just fluctuating, and we don't have to necessarily conserve this population directly. Regardless, when I started my project, it looked like there was a 40% decline in the Leach's storm-petrel population on Baccalieu Island, and therefore it really required immediate conservation action. So to go back to Baccalieu Island, right now what I have shown here is a map of where the Leach's storm-petrel nest in green, and where the next most abundant seabird, the Atlantic puffin, nests in red. Now I just show you this to show that Leach's storm-petrel are nesting around the ponds, and the other seabirds are nesting along the cliff sides. So any of the inputs into the ponds that we measure are mostly correlated to Leach's storm-petrel as opposed to a different seabird. The other thing I want to show you here is that we binned our lakes as high impact and moderate impact and a reference site. Now you don't need to know the names. I'm just going to be using a consistent color theme. So green is going to be our high impact sites. Green is just showing eutrophied lakes. Gold, or the yellow color, is going to be moderately impacted. And then blue is going to be our clean water or reference site. So when we began this study, the first thing that we needed to establish was that the birds are truly impacting the sites. And that would be reflected in the water chemistry. Now, if the water chemistry is actually being affected by the seabirds, you would expect total phosphorus, or the nutrients being introduced, to follow more nutrients on the right, and then low nutrients on the left. So oligotrophic generally is considered clean water or clear water, low nutrient concentrations. And that's where we would expect our reference site that doesn't have any seabird inputs. And that's exactly what we see. And then you would expect where the seabirds are actually introducing and affecting the sites to be on the far right. They're hypereutrophic. And that's exactly what we see. Eutrophic is a greenish lake. And then when you get into hypereutrophic, that's like toxically high nutrients within a lake. So it does look like the seabirds are actually affecting the water chemistry of the sites. So a lot of things can affect water chemistry. So we should also look at things like metals. Metals are biomagnified by the seabirds, and so you would expect the reference site to be on the left, and then again, our high impact sites to be on the right. And that's exactly what we see. Reference site at detection limit for the water chemistry, and our seabird impacted sites are actually toxic for aquatic life in long-term studies. So extremely toxic water chemistry. So with that established, the next thing I want to show you is I'm just going to jump right into the results of our study. So as I mentioned before, we looked at multiple proxies. So on the left here, you have several proxies like nitrogen-15, diatoms, chironomids, metals, sediment chlorophyll, and cholesterol. And so if we're truly tracking seabird dynamics, what you would expect is that all of the proxies, when the birds are in high abundance, to increase. And then when the birds are not there, those proxies should all decrease together. The other thing I'll note is that our x-axis here is the years before present. So 2000 is recent sediment on the right, and then we're going back in time. So we're always moving forward in time to the right. And so when we look at the results of the study, what you can see is that over 1700 years, we have peaks in our seabird dynamics around 500 CE, and then a second time around 2000. Now the light green is just showing where there are increases in all of the proxies, but at lower numbers compared to the recent population size. Now I understand that looking at it this way is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to show you it one more time, but in a more digestible method. So again, our x-axis is showing change in time. So on the left here is our oldest sediment, and then we're going forward in time until recently. And then I'm showing all of the proxies as a z-score. So z-score is just a standardized method for all of our proxies. You can't compare the percentage of a certain diatom to concentration of a metal. So instead you standardize it all so that increases in a number is all just increases in the proxy, and you can then average those proxies together. And what you can see here again is showing that what we have is in the black line, the Leach's storm-petrel trends over the last 1700 years. Seabird numbers were low, reaching a peak around 500 CE or 1500 years ago. The population then declined in size. The colony was small on Baccalieu, and then around 250 years ago, the colony began to rapidly increase, reaching a peak and then declining at the surface. Now, if you recall, there were two surveys that were done on Baccalieu, the first in 1984 and 2013. And that's what I highlight here in these two dashed lines. You can see that between 1984 and 2013, when the surveys suggested a population decline, that's completely being supported by our paleolimnological proxies, showing that the colony increased to a peak and then began to decline. Now, the one thing that really jumps out here is the importance for long-term data. Had this original survey from 1984 been done, say, in the 1950s over here, when you compare that to 2013, the colony size would have actually looked stable as opposed to in decline, and therefore wouldn't be looked at for conservation biology. So it really highlights the importance for considering long-term data and shifting baselines. The other important thing to note here is that there are distinct peaks in the colony size. So that's really what I began to focus on and was wondering to myself, what is causing these fluctuations in the colony size? It seems like something important is happening here. And the main hypothesis that we have right now is that intercolony recruitment seems to be a really important factor for Leach's storm-petrel. Now, intercolony recruitment simply means moving from one colony to the other over periods of generation. This is supported by on-the-ground work showing that storm-petrels display extensive natal dispersal, so young birds go to different colonies. There's intercolony movement at night, so adolescent birds will explore different colonies, and there's really high gene flow amongst the Atlantic basin. So this is called the seabird paradox. You would expect colonies of individual birds to have that are continually returning to the same island to breed to be very genetically distinct between other colonies. But that's not what we see with Leach's storm-petrel. They have high gene flow between these colonies. So if intercolony recruitment is important between Leach's storm-petrel colonies, then the next question naturally becomes, well, what's the driver of these natural fluctuations? What happens on Baccalieu and other colonies to cause the birds to want to go to a different place than where they were born and where they were bred? So there's two main factors that I strongly considered. The first was local factors. So say the introduction of a predator, which caused the seabirds to move to a different island, or habitat availability. There simply wasn't enough habitat available for these Leach's storm-petrels to breed. The second is possibly regional factors, so changes in ocean currents, like in the Labrador Current. And so these are two things that I next explored in my next data chapter. So we'll begin by looking at, is data availability the driver? And this is possible using the same sediment cores that I looked at in the past for population dynamics, but instead of looking at proxies that relate to the birds, I looked at proxies that relate to vegetation on the island. So I examined aerial photography, palynology, and stereos and stanols. So I'll begin by looking at the aerial photography. So I went to the Ottawa National Air Photo Library in Ottawa, and they have this amazing collection of photos from around Canada. So after World War I, they had all of these pilots who were trained to fly planes, but they didn't really have anything to do. So what they did is the government mandated that they go around and photograph all of these small islands and territories around Canada. And so that's how you have some of these early photos of, say, Baccalieu Island, this one from 1940. And what I did is I took these photos and I delineated vegetated areas where the storm-petrels can breed, and heath where the storm-petrels don't breed, so the rocky areas. And when you binarily delineate that from green for where the storm-petrels can breed to the gray where the storm-petrels can't breed, it looks something like this. Now, if you take several of these maps, you can begin to investigate, has the amount of vegetation on the island increased or decreased over time? So I took several of these photos, the first from 1940, then 1978, and then 2017, a period that the storm-petrel colony increased in size, and checked, is the vegetation on the island decreasing or is it stable? And what I found was that from 1940 until 2017, there was a 35% increase in the available nesting habitat for Leach's storm-petrel as that colony increased in size. Now, you might also be thinking to yourself, well, I thought the colony was declining since the 1980s. That is true, but the vegetation continued to increase. We hypothesize that the reason for this is either climate warming or vegetation inertia. So nutrients in soil take a really long period of time for it to be used up. And so high nutrient soils can continue to fertilize vegetation for decades after the source of nutrients stopped. So next, I wanted to look at the palynology, which is essentially just the pollen and pollen grains and fungal grains within the sediment core. And I looked at two main groupings, the first being trees, which is considered marginal or secondary habitat for Leach's storm-petrel, and low-lying vegetation, so things like ferns and grasses. Storm-petrels prefer to nest in ferns and grasses because there's less root structure, which is easier for them to burrow and build their nests. They can do this in trees, but it's less preferred. So if we looked at the relative abundance of trees and this low-lying preferred vegetation, and we show the average in the dashed line there, when the Leach's storm-petrel population increased in size during those green periods, you can see that trees decreased in abundance, whereas the low-lying vegetation at the same time increased in abundance. And you see that again in that first colony peak there. So what it appears to show is that as Leach's storm-petrel population increases in size, they actually increase the amount of preferred habitat. It's causing a positive feedback loop. They're killing off of the trees, and the trees are being replaced by mosses, grasses, ferns, all of these amazing habitats for Leach's storm-petrels. So positive feedback loop, the population is growing, which creates more vegetation for them to nest in, causing the population to grow, et cetera, et cetera. So naturally, the next question for me was, well, what started this positive feedback loop? Did the seabirds cause the nutrients to increase and therefore support more vegetation? Or is there a different climatic effect that caused the vegetation to increase, therefore causing more birds to increase? So kind of like a chicken and the egg scenario. What came first? And so in order to look at that, I looked at something called sterols and stanols. These are cholesterol groups that are found in all biological membranes. So sterols are important alcohol groups in biological membranes, and stanols are simply the reduction product of sterols. And different biological groups will have different collections of sterols and stanols. So if you look at the guano of Leach's storm-petrel, you can see that it's 98% cholesterol. Whereas if you look at, say, vegetation and plants, it's almost exclusively cytosterol and stigmasterol. So if you look at the relative ratios of these two groups, cholesterol to cytosterol and stigmasterol, within a sediment core, you can see whether or not the birds came first or the plants came first. And so on the left here, we have cholesterol, and on the right, we have the plants. And what you can see is that first came the cholesterol, then came the cytosterol. So it appears that the birds began to increase in abundance first, and then the plants began to follow that. So after this study, I concluded that Leach's storm-petrels are acting as ecosystem engineers, and they have a huge, significant impact on the overall vegetation of the island. It appears that they are increasing the amount of vegetation on the island. They're creating a positive feedback loop that is increasing the amount of habitat available for them to nest. And they're the ones driving increases in vegetation as opposed to a different climatic effect. And so vegetation and habitat does not appear to be limited on the island. And so that first hypothesis that I had about what's causing those fluctuations in seabirds, habitat availability, does not appear to be the main driver of it. So the next question obviously is, well, if it's something regional then that's driving these fluctuations in Leach's storm-petrel on Baccalieu Island, we should expect similar fluctuations in colony size on different islands. So I went to a different island called Grand Colombier in Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, which is just south of Newfoundland, to explore this question. So you can see that Grand Colombier is here off of the Burin Peninsula in Newfoundland, which is around 270 kilometers away from Baccalieu. Another reason why I wanted to explore this colony is it appeared to be stable, which is a really interesting dynamic because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, most Leach's storm-petrel colonies are in decline. So I was thinking to myself, well, if we can figure out why this colony is stable, maybe that'll give us some ideas on how we can support the Baccalieu Island colony as well to have a stable colony there. So I looked at one major pond on Grand Colombier, the only pond on the island, and then I looked at 3 reference sites here. So as I mentioned, there were 4 surveys done on Grand Colombier. The thing to note here is that the different surveys were done differently. They all use different methods to estimate the population size. So we first standardized all of them. And when we standardized the colony censuses, it appeared that the colony is stable. So it's stable since the 1980s. But what happens if we extend the temporal scale? What if we go back in time? Is this trend going to remain true? So I'm going to jump right into the overall trends, same way as I showed before. This is going to be the Z-score of 5 different proxies that are all representing seabirds. And then on our x-axis, we're going forward in time from around 6,000 years ago, all the way to recent here on the right. And what you can see is that the Leach's storm-petrel colony on Grand Colombier increased, had one peak in the colony size around 2,500 years ago, then had a divot in the population size, and then had a huge colony around 1,000 years ago, which was stable up until around 1816, where you have a dramatic decline in the Leach's storm-petrel colony. And this period of decline lines up perfectly with the establishment of permanent European settlement in Saint-Pierre-Miquelon. So it appears that Leach's storm-petrels were happily living. They had natural colony dynamics up until human arrival around 200 years ago. Now the current colony size is only around 16%. So even though it is stable now, this is only 16% of the potential carrying capacity that was shown around 500 years ago. Now, I'm sure I don't have to convince everyone, but European settlement has significant and well-documented effects on seabird populations. Specifically on Grand Colombier, Leach's storm-petrels weren't necessarily eaten, but they were used as candles, as you can see in this newspaper clipping from 1929. Because they're seabirds that are extremely oily, a wick was pushed through the birds and you could use that as a candle. There's also anecdotal evidence of rats arriving on the island from crashing boats. Shipping and fishing collisions and light pollution all have significant impacts on Leach's storm-petrels. And what I suggest is that all of those factors together accumulated and caused the population to decline by such a dramatic amount, around 80%. So what happens if we compare the two colonies? What if we compare the trends on Grand Colombier to Baccalieu? Now, if a regional factor is causing all of the seabird colonies to decline at the same time, we would expect that Grand Colombier and Baccalieu, their trends to be synchronous, an increase at the same time and a decrease at the same time. But if the birds are actually, like we suggested, recruiting and moving from one colony to the other, then those trends on Baccalieu and Grand Colombier should be asynchronous. And that's exactly what we see here. You can see in the black line is Grand Colombier and in the red line is Baccalieu. And you can see that the first peak on Grand Colombier began to decline, and at that time, Baccalieu began to increase. And then again, number two, perfectly fluctuating asynchronously. Now, I'm not saying that all of the birds from Baccalieu are moving to Grand Colombier and vice versa. There are several colonies along the Atlantic, the Newfoundland coast, and those birds are simply likely moving from one place to the other amongst several of those colonies. We just have two that we have long-term dynamics for. So my final question that I have right now, and unfortunately I have to leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger because this is where I'm at with my PhD, is I'm trying to figure out what is the long-term driver of these fluctuations. And what I suspect is causing long-term fluctuations in Leach's storm-petrels over millennia is changes in the North Atlantic Oscillation, the subpolar gyre. So the subpolar gyre and NAO, they fluctuate, which causes changes in the oceanic fronts, which can push food up. It can also change the temperature of the feeding grounds, as well as prey availability and habitat quality. So what you can see here is A is where on Baccalieu, the Leach's storm-petrels feed, and you can see where they're feeding along this blue coast here. And you can see that it's really strongly influenced by the cold Labrador current coming from the north. Whereas the Grand Colombier colony here in purple is feeding down here into the south. And you can see that the Labrador current is actually being buffered by the Gulf Stream, which can actually mediate the availability of prey. So right now what I'm exploring is I'm comparing long-term dynamics to changes in reconstructed oscillations in currents to see if there's a correlation there. And that might be what's driving birds to move from one colony to the other, but I don't have any concrete conclusions to this point. But overall, what I want to conclude with is just a few implications of this work. So the first is that long-term data are really needed to address shifting baseline syndrome. So shifting baseline syndrome, as I mentioned before, is that we only have very recent data that are indicating population declines, but you need long-term data predating natural or predating anthropogenic factors causing the population to decline to really understand natural variability within a population and to understand to what level we need to conserve a species. Second, it's important that Leach's storm-petrels require a expanded management area. So because Leach's storm-petrels appear to be moving from one colony to the other over periods of centuries, it's important that multiple islands are managed and supported in a conservation biology method. And finally, regular monitoring is required into the future. So the paleolimnological results are great in that they can show long-term fluctuations, but the resolution of those data is pretty coarse. So regular monitoring into the future is a far better method than the paleolimnological data to inform the future and how well management is happening. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And if I don't get to your questions, please do feel free to email me at my email here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think everyone's going to join me in thanking you for the very fascinating talk. It was great. So we'll move on to questions now. I think just to keep everything consistent, what we'll do is if you have a question, please either indicate that in the chat, just so I can keep everyone in order. And I'll let Matt know you can unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can type your question into the chat and I can ask it for you. So up to you. Perfect. Okay, Adam will start us off.
Hello, sorry, I'm a little slow because I'm using my phone there. Thanks very much, great talk. My question is about the resolution when you're looking at the sediment data. So just by my eyes, when I'm squinting at your Z-score figures, it seems like the dynamics, like way back when, for the really old parts of the sediment, just seem a little dampened compared to the newer ones. And I wonder, do you think that's real? Well, first of all, do you agree that looks that way? I mean, I'm just, took a quick squint at it. And then if that is real, do you think that that's like a function of just part of using this sediments for this type of data? Or do you think that that's like a real thing? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so great question. So the way that sediment accumulates is over time, because the sediment at the top is pushing down on the sediment at the bottom, you end up having compaction. And so the sediment at the bottom, 1 centimeter, that's the finest resolution that we get, or 1/2 centimeter, might represent, say, 10 years. And at the very top of the sediment, depending on the accumulation rate, 1 centimeter might be, say, 5 years. So as you go deeper in time, each section ends up representing more time. And so because of that, we use statistical techniques to kind of work with that, but it does result in a dampening effect at the bottom of the sediment core. Those trends are less clear. But for the main questions that I was asking is that colony decline on Baccalieu true? I used extremely high resolution. So I used every single 1/2 centimeter to do all of my proxies. And because of that, I was able to get high resolution. But the further back in time you go, for the Grand Colombier record or other records that are, you can imagine a sediment core being 5 meters long, it's completely unreasonable to do every single 1/2 centimeter. So you pick and choose. And so what I do is I usually do really high resolution at the top, because that's really the questions that we're interested in. And then I use lower resolution down core. And that kind of addresses that question in that sediment, that's just the way it accumulates, and my method of choosing samples to actually measure. Hope that makes sense.
For sure, thanks very much.
All right, we got any more questions? If not for now, I have one for you, Matt. I'm just curious about this, this positive feedback effect on the vegetation on the island. I guess, I don't know if you have any insight on that, but if they're changing the vegetation to make things better for themselves, is that having any effect on the other nesting bird populations on the island? Is that taking away habitat from them at all?
Yeah, that's interesting. So most of the birds on Baccalieu are cliff nesters, so probably wouldn't affect them. We're kind of fortunate in the ecology of Leach's storm-petrels that they do nest on the inland of the island. And so all of their nutrients get washed in. There are other birds like puffin that are nesting there that actually probably would prefer it. But admittedly, I'm not a seabird ecologist, so that's not my expertise. I admittedly know more about sediment as opposed to that. But I think it would be a good thing for other birds as well.
Cool. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I didn't expect you to necessarily know the answer, but that's kind of cool, having far-reaching effects. Great, thank you. It looks like Bill has a question. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, hi Matt. Great talk. Good to hear that. It's clear, how important it is to get these baselines. Be it seabirds. I mean, recently I've been spending a lot of time looking at forage fish, and it's the same thing. How can we ever possibly differentiate natural variation from a fishery effect? And 99% of the time we can't. so it is really important to put those things in perspective, and so applause for doing that. But I just really want to point out, because you emphasize the importance of that for conservation, and I am not here to deny it, but I just want to emphasize as well that those short-term effects are critical for conservation biology. So the gradient in the population decline that you showed for Leach's storm-petrels is the steepest one on your curve that goes over 1,700 years. And it's completely coincident with offshore lighting on the Grand Banks that came online about, in the 1990s. And so it does really highlight, this is an important issue, and it really highlights something we should be looking at. And I'm sure you wouldn't deny that, but I just wanted to point that out because we have to pay attention. We need the context for the long term, but we have to pay attention. And why we have to do it. Why, because climate change is not, proceeding at a linear, everything now is non-linear and step change and alternation. So I don't know if you maybe had a response to that or some thoughts of yours.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, as we've been trying to write these manuscripts up, that's something that we're always very cognizant of, because I really don't want the data to be taken out of context or in a context that shows, the population was its highest in the 1980s and it only began to increase 200 years ago. So really, we don't care about these birds. They can decline by huge amounts. That's not at all what I want to show. I really want to show just the importance of having long-term context to really contextualize recent declines. As you mentioned, that recent decline from the 1980s until present, that magnitude of decline is extremely steep. Sure, the population quickly reached a peak from the 1700s until 1980, but now it's declining at an exponential rate at a time where anthropogenic impacts are only increasing. So it still really shows the importance to manage and conserve this island, as well as many other islands. And I think our Grand Colombier study, better highlights the importance of that long-term data. I didn't mention this in my talk, but Grand Colombier was never really considered as an important place to conserve and manage right now, because the colony appears to be stable. But in fact, it's only a fraction of what it used to be in the past. And so we really actually should be putting effort into restoring the dynamics of that colony. It used to be an important place for Leach's storm-petrel, and now it's only a fraction of what it used to be. So, yeah.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have any more questions from folks? I got another one, just like after Phil's question, if you don't mind. Like in general, you said that like storm-petrels are like the populations, or I guess the numbers of storm-petrels in general are declining. Does that go for storm-petrels everywhere? Like, is that?
Yeah.
So like your graphs there, is that, I guess not really understanding how you calculate everything in terms of the Z-score. Is that showing, like, when you compare Baccalieu and Grand Colombier, is that like would that be representative of the actual number of birds, or just like a general sense of the density of the population?
Right. Okay. So globally, based on every survey available, the population is in decline. The meta population is in decline. But what I show in my Z-scores is specifically colonies. And so sometimes I might have used the word population inaccurately. Those are specifically colony trends. And so when I show that decline, unfortunately, it's impossible to associate that kind of esoteric number to, say, 1 million birds or 2 million birds, because the relationship between sediment proxies and seabirds is nonlinear. So it's a complex relationship. So instead, I just show a generalized, the population is increasing versus the population is decreasing. And so all I'm showing is magnitudes of change and magnitudes relative to the time scale that we have. So our time scale, 1700 years or 6,000 years, but it's not the global population size, and it's not necessarily specific numbers of decline. It's just more birds, higher number, fewer birds, lower number. That's all that's showing.
Makes sense. Thanks. Yeah, that's it. I guess there is definitely reason for concern.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, definitely.
Do we have any more questions from anyone? If not, maybe we'll just leave it there. And thank you again, Matt, for the excellent talk. It was super interesting. And thanks for kicking it off for us this year. Really happy to have you.
Great. Thanks everyone so much for listening.
Thanks. See ya.